When the man you marry writes of betrayal as a necessity, how long before he turns the blade of logic on love itself? That question would one day haunt her in silence. But on the morning of their wedding, Marietta Corsini believed she was stepping into a life of dignity and quiet admiration. Florence still wore its Renaissance pride like a finely woven cloak, elegant, golden in the autumn sun, and riddled with holes that no one dared mend. Outside the church walls, families whispered of wars, popes, and princes. Inside, Marietta laced her fingers together and tried not to shake. Niccolò Machiavelli was not a soldier, nor a nobleman in the strictest sense. He didn't ride into her life on a white horse, but walked in with ink-stained fingers, laughter in his voice, and too many opinions to count. He was already a senior official in the Florentine Republic, a diplomat trusted to speak with kings, organize militias, and report on the strange affairs of men with crowns. He had ambition, not titles. He had a mind like a maze, and perhaps it was that very thing that first drew her in. The sense that behind his gaze, entire empires lived and died without her noticing. Marietta came from a proud family, the Corsinis, one of the old patrician lineages that prided themselves on restraint and reputation. She had been raised to be steady, quiet, devout, and yet there was something in her that leaned toward contradiction, the same kind of contradiction that Niccolò represented. He was not handsome in the classic sense, but there was fire behind his words, a hunger to understand and reshape the world. She had watched him speak to groups of men more powerful than himself and leave them speechless with only a sentence. Their wedding was modest but full of political symbolism. Her family did not entirely approve of Niccolò's Republican ideals, but they tolerated him because he had risen fast and because he had not yet fallen. The Medici had been exiled, and the Republic of Florence was led by figures like Piero Soderini, men who shared Niccolò's vision for a free and virtuous city-state. In the public square, republicanism was a banner. In private homes like hers, it was a risk. From the beginning, their marriage was a balancing act between public life and private devotion. Niccolò would leave home for days, weeks, even months at a time, traveling to courts in France, Rome, and the territories of Cesare Borgia. Each time he returned, Marietta noticed the layers of his idealism peeling away, replaced by something colder. He spoke of power not as a gift to be given, but as a game to be won, and he seemed increasingly fascinated by those who played it without apology. In the early years, Florence was on a knife's edge. Foreign armies pressed on all sides. The Pope in Rome acted less like a shepherd and more like a warlord. Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, rose like a storm across central Italy, carving out his own fiefdom with brutality and brilliance. Niccolò, sent as an envoy to observe Borgia, returned shaken, but also enthralled. He could not stop speaking of the Duke's cunning, his calculated cruelty, his understanding that men are not moved by virtue but by fear and necessity. Marietta, ever the observer, kept her thoughts guarded. She believed in Florence, in the Republic, in God, and in the possibility that her husband would not be consumed by the things he studied. But late at night, when he scribbled furiously by candlelight, she sometimes saw his face illuminated by something harsher than waxlight. Obsession. He was building theories, not just recording observations. He had begun to speak of power as if it were a science, reducible to patterns, weaknesses, and laws. He no longer spoke of right or wrong, only of what worked and what failed. And though he still kissed her goodnight and spoke gently to the children, she felt something important slipping from his grip. Then came the earthquake, not one of nature, but of politics. In 1512, the Medici returned to Florence, carried not by the will of the people, but on the backs of Spanish soldiers. The fragile republic collapsed almost overnight. Soderini fled. Friends betrayed friends. Lists of conspirators were drawn up, and Niccolò's name was on one of them. He was accused of conspiring against the Medici, a charge he denied but could not escape. He was imprisoned, tortured, not for confession, but for reassurance. Florence wanted to make examples, not sense. Marietta was left alone, humiliated, burdened with children and debts and the ridicule of those who had once praised her husband. The same men who had shaken his hand in the grand chambers now crossed the street to avoid her gaze. Even some of her relatives urged her to separate from him, for the sake of her name, her children, her future. But she would not. Not because she believed he was innocent, or even because she loved him blindly, but because she understood something deeper about him that others didn't. He was not wicked. He was wounded by the way the world rewarded betrayal. After weeks of agony, Machiavelli was released. Not pardoned, merely discarded. His hands, once used to sign treaties, were now calloused from being bound. He returned home, a shadow of the man she had married. And yet something had hardened inside him. Florence had betrayed its own, and he would not forget. He spoke little during those first months, but his eyes were always watching, calculating. He spent hours walking the fields of their countryside estate in Sant'Andrea in Percusina, watching vines grow and clouds gather. Marietta tended to the household, managed the servants they could barely afford, taught their children to read and pray. She waited for her husband to return to himself, but Niccolò was not interested in returning. He was in his own way, beginning again. Each night he shut himself in the study and wrote. He called it Il Principe, the prince. It was not a memoir or a confession, but something more dangerous. A manual for how power truly worked, stripped of illusions. He wrote of cruelty used wisely, deception used sparingly, and fear used always. He dissected the human soul like a butcher with a cleaver, unapologetic, precise. And yet, he dedicated the book to a Medici. Marietta read early drafts with quiet dread. It was not merely that the book lacked compassion, it was that it seemed to treat compassion itself as a liability. She had known her husband to be warm, witty, affectionate, and now she saw him shaping a legacy that might erase those qualities forever. He told her it was the only way back, that he needed to prove his usefulness to the Medici if he ever wanted to re-enter politics. She asked him gently what it would cost. He didn't answer. Not then. One night she watched him sleep and realized something profound. Niccolò had not changed because of what had been done to him. He had always carried the seed of this realism, this darkness. It had simply taken failure and exile to make it flower. She thought of their wedding day, the murmurs, the pride, the political optimism, and wondered if she had married the man or the mind, and if the mind could ever truly love anything except itself. The candle in his study burned long into the morning. Florence stirred with new unrest, and Marietta, from the edge of history, prepared to walk the long shadow beside a man no longer chasing power, but determined to define it. To the world he would become a monster or a genius. To her he would remain both, and neither. Because before he became infamous, before kings read his words in secret, and before the prince was whispered like heresy across courts and cathedrals, he had been simply her husband, and she had married a pen, not a sword. Florence had always been a city of mass, beauty veiling blood, art veiling ambition. But in 1512, the mask cracked. Spanish troops marched through Tuscany like iron through silk, and behind them came the return of the Medici family, exiled for nearly 2 decades. The dream of a republic, delicate and idealistic, collapsed under boots and betrayal. In the public square, the marble statue of David stood tall, a symbol of civic virtue, but the men who once praised it now whispered behind closed doors, adjusting their loyalties like cloaks in the wind. Niccolò Machiavelli was not built for such winds, or perhaps he was, but only as an observer, not a survivor. He had served the Florentine Republic with unshakable devotion, 24 diplomatic missions, countless reports, military reforms, and strategies crafted to keep the fragile republic breathing amid wolves. But when the Medici returned, they brought vengeance cloaked in forgiveness. Old lists resurfaced. Old names once carved into the wood of trust became targets. Niccolò's was among them. The knock on the door came in the early gray of morning. Marietta rose first, wrapping a shawl over her shoulders, expecting perhaps a neighbor or another courier bearing bad news. But it was worse. Soldiers unsmiling. No warrant, no explanation. Just a name spoken like a curse. Machiavelli. He didn't resist. He stood straight-backed and quiet, kissed his children, and looked once at Marietta, something unspoken trembling behind his eyes. Not fear, not even defiance, just the awareness that the story he had tried to write was about to be rewritten by others. He was taken to the Bargello, the ancient palace of justice turned prison. There, over days that bled into nights, he was subjected to the strappado, a torture that dislocated the arms by hanging a man from them and dropping him suddenly. He did not confess. Whether this was a matter of innocence or sheer stubbornness, no one could say. But Florence, still shedding the skin of its republic, needed no confession. They needed only silence. Marietta was not allowed to see him. She moved through Florence like a ghost, her name now spoken with ridicule or pity. Women who once curtsied now looked away. Men who had toasted her husband's wit and strategy now changed the subject at her approach. Her own family, the Corsinis, offered her sanctuary, but only if she distanced herself from the man they now called dangerous, tainted, finished. She declined. With calm politeness, she declined. Instead, she stood in line at the Bargello with other wives and mothers, bearing food her husband would never eat, writing letters that would never be answered. She managed the household alone, selling off jewelry and heirlooms to pay debts that multiplied like shadows. The children asked where their father had gone. She told them truthfully that he had gone to serve Florence, though she no longer believed Florence deserved him. When Machiavelli was finally released, it was not due to justice, but custom. A new pope, Leo X, a Medici himself, declared a jubilee, offering general pardons to prisoners. It was a political maneuver dressed as mercy. Machiavelli returned to their home in San Andrea in Percusina, with sunken eyes, trembling hands, and a new silence lodged between his ribs like a knife. He laughed less. He wrote more. Marietta greeted him not with celebration, but with care. She did not ask what had happened in prison, nor did he volunteer the answer. But every movement of his arms betrayed pain. Every time he dressed, she saw the bruises darkening into memory. Florence had changed, so had he. But it was not bitterness that grew in him. It was distance. He no longer spoke of restoring the Republic. He spoke instead of how it had fallen, the treachery, the cowardice, the soft-minded idealism. He cataloged each failure like a surgeon identifying the organs of a corpse. At night, while the children slept, he began drafting a new kind of writing. Not diplomacy, not poetry, not history, but a distillation of all he had learned from watching power up close. Its lies, its theater, its violence made elegant. Marietta knew the rhythm of his writing. She could hear it from the next room, the furious scratching of quill, the pause for thought, the clink of a cup of wine half drunk. She prepared his ink, replaced his candles, swept the study when he forgot to eat. He thanked her in murmurs, but his mind was always elsewhere. And yet, even as he retreated into thought, he depended on her utterly. It was she who mediated between him and the world, filtering letters, managing visits, shielding him from the humiliation of old friends who came not out of loyalty but curiosity. She became the fortress behind the ruined fortress, holding together the remnants of a life that had once been part of statecraft and now belonged only to pages. Niccolò's exile was not unique in Florence. Many men fell with the Republic, but most faded quietly. He instead sharpened his pen like a blade. The prince was not yet finished, but its outline was already dangerous. In it, he praised Cesare Borgia, the very man who had nearly conquered Florence. He spoke of fear as more reliable than love, cruelty as a medicine, deception as a necessity. He called for action, not morals, results, not righteousness. Marietta read fragments when he was not looking. At first she assumed it was a satire, a mirror held to monstrous men. But the more she read, the more she understood. This was not mockery, it was instruction, a blueprint for survival in a world without mercy. She wanted to ask him, "Do you believe these things, or do you merely observe them?" But she knew what his answer would be. He would say that belief had nothing to do with it, that this is how power moves. That truth is a luxury, not a strategy. Still, she worried, not for herself, not even for their children, but for the man she had married, the one who once believed that a republic of citizens could stand against kings. One evening during a rare moment of tenderness, he told her that the worst part of exile was not the loss of title or income, but the realization that nobody had truly missed him, that the city he had given everything to could turn away so easily. He did not weep, but she did, because in that moment, she saw not the man history would name Machiavellian, but the boy who had once written poetry to the morning sun over the Arno, who had believed in civic virtue, who had laughed too loudly at supper. Florence had fallen. So had her husband. But in the fall, something else had been born, something colder, sharper, more enduring than political office or noble blood. A voice that would outlive kingdoms. And she, Marietta Corsini, once a quiet bride in a city of artists, would become the silent witness to the most dangerous idea Italy had ever produced. Not because she agreed with it, but because she understood the man who needed to write it. And because sometimes love is not the force that saves a man, but the shelter that allows him to become something terrible and true. The vineyards of Sant'Andrea in Percosina were not a prison, but they were not freedom either. The hills rolled gently, olive trees nodded under the sun, and the silence stretched long enough to hear one's own thoughts grow fangs. For Niccolò Machiavelli, exile from Florence was a kind of death, but one that did not bury the body, only the name. For Marietta, it was something crueler still, to live alongside a man undone, to sleep beside ambition, stripped of audience, and to tend to the ashes of a legacy not yet cold. Their home outside the city was modest, though it bore the faded elegance of a family once respected. Chickens wandered freely, vines twisted along stone walls, the children ran barefoot, unaware of what had been lost. But inside the walls the air was taut with silence, with the clatter of quills, with the restless pacing of a man who had once spoken to kings and now lectured only to himself. Niccolò rose early, often before dawn. By mid-morning he had worked the garden, exchanged pleasantries with neighbors who eyed him cautiously, and retreated into his study. There the real work began, not diplomacy, not public service, but dissection of power, of memory, of betrayal. The hours he once gave to Florence were now poured into parchment. The Republic had cast him aside, but he would make sure it never forgot what it had lost. He called the project Il Principe, the prince, but it was no ode to nobility. It was a scalpel drawn across the soft skin of political idealism. He wrote of Cesare Borgia, not as a villain but as an example. He examined cruelty as a function of efficiency, deception as a tool of order, fear as a currency more stable than love. Every chapter struck like a confession, though the crime was not his, but civilization's. Marietta watched it unfold without intruding. She brought him bread and wine. She changed his ink. She offered no opinions unless asked, and he rarely asked. But that did not mean she was absent from the work. She was its atmosphere, the silent gravity around which his thoughts orbited. And in her quiet observations, she saw the transformation that Florence would not see until it was too late. Her husband had always been clever, but now he was dangerous. In the evenings, they sat together. He read aloud passages not from the prince, but from his comedic plays, satirical farces that mocked the very court culture he had once been part of. She smiled politely, sometimes laughed. But it was the other work, the secret manuscript that haunted her. He insisted it was not a justification, not a surrender to cynicism, but a mirror. "Let them see themselves," he muttered one night. "And if they don't like what they see, let them change, not the mirror." Marietta wanted to believe him, but she also knew that mirrors do not merely reflect. They distort depending on the angle, the light, the viewer. And she feared what would happen when others saw in his words not a warning, but a weapon. His letters to friends grew more frequent. He pleaded for reinstatement, begged for even the smallest government commission, wrote flattering dedications to Medici patrons. All went unanswered or refused. He was still a name too dangerous to touch. The rejection did not soften him, it sharpened him. By the winter of 1513, the prince was complete. He dedicated it to Lorenzo de' Medici, not from admiration, but strategy. The manuscript was not printed. It was circulated discreetly in manuscript form, like a forbidden gospel. Those who read it passed it along, some with admiration, others with horror. It was a book that dared to strip politics of pretense, to suggest that morality was not a path to power, but often its grave. In church, sermons began to whisper of devilry. In salons, nobles debated whether Machiavelli was genius or heretic. In Rome, the papal court labeled the book dangerous, though it would not be officially banned until years later. But in San Andrea, none of that mattered. There, Marietta tended to her husband's shoes, his meals, his children, his loneliness. She watched as he became more myth than man. There was a night deep in autumn when he returned from a walk through the vineyards with mud on his boots and a fire in his eyes. He told her he had been thinking about Fortuna, the Roman goddess of chance, the embodiment of chaos, and how a ruler must wrestle her like a wild woman if he is to master her. Fortuna, he declared, is a woman, and to command her, one must be bold, forceful, unafraid to seize her by violence. Marietta said nothing, but inside she recoiled. It was not just the metaphor, it was the ease with which he said it, the casual justification of conquest as seduction, of power as something taken, never shared. He was no longer writing about politics. He was speaking about nature itself, and he no longer saw mercy as part of that nature. Their intimacy, once marked by playfulness, became ritual. He was tender in gestures but remote in spirit. He kissed her forehead, praised her loyalty, but never asked what she thought of the work that now defined his existence. Perhaps he feared her answer. Perhaps he already knew it, but she remained. Not because she agreed, not because she hoped to change him, but because she had made a vow not only to the man, but to the weight he carried. And because deep down, she saw the cost of that weight, how it hollowed him, how it kept him awake at night, scribbling furiously, chasing a truth that no longer comforted but consumed. Their children grew. Florence simmered. Europe braced for more war. And still, in a farmhouse outside the city, a man who had once advised kings now wrote like one possessed, and a woman whose name would never grace the history books made sure the candles never went out. In time, the world would see Niccolò Machiavelli as a monster or a prophet. But in those quiet years of exile, he was something else entirely. A husband wrestling with the ruins of meaning, and a wife holding up the walls around a man who could no longer believe in them. Because exile does not simply remove a person from power, it replaces power with silence. And in that silence, if left unchecked, even love must learn to whisper, lest it be mistaken for weakness. History would remember him as many things: the father of modern political thought, the scribe of cruelty, the man who taught tyrants to cloak daggers with silk. But for years after writing The Prince, Niccolò Machiavelli remained something far less grand. An unemployed former secretary, living in the countryside with a reputation too dangerous for power and too compelling to ignore. And behind the silence of his exile, there was Marietta Corsini, not a muse, not a political partner, but the patient steward of his legacy and the last voice of conscience in a world where principles had turned to ash. The manuscript of The Prince drifted quietly among Florentine elite circles, passed from hand to hand like contraband scripture. Niccolò had hoped that dedicating the book to Lorenzo de' Medici might open the doors of service once more. He had imagined being recalled to court, consulted in the rebuilding of Florence, perhaps even forgiven for his Republican loyalties. But the Medici were shrewder than he credited. They knew that power rested on forgetting, not remembering. Niccolò had served the wrong regime. Brilliantly, yes, but passionately. And passion is dangerous when it belongs to a man who writes better than he begs. Instead of reinstatement, he received polite refusals. Instead of invitations, he received rumors. The Florentine court began to refer to him in hushed tones. Il Machiavelli, they said, like a title rather than a name. Some claimed he had sold his soul to the devil. Others said he merely described the world as it was. But few dared say they admired the book openly. It was too clear-eyed, too naked in its view of power, and too willing to say what others only dared think. Back in Sant'Andrea, the gap between reputation and reality widened. While whispers spread in salons, Niccolò tilled soil, wrote comedic plays to earn money, and took up history writing to preserve a version of himself that might be palatable. Florence commissioned him, cautiously, to write the history of Florence, a gesture that was both opportunity and insult. He took it with a thin smile. It was in these years that Marietta watched her husband become a contradiction. In the mornings, he walked among peasants, joked with innkeepers, and played dice with strangers. In the afternoons, he locked himself in his study and dissected power like a surgeon without anesthesia. At night, he read aloud absurd comedies full of fools and farce, laughter stitched over sorrow. But beneath it all, something deeper festered, a profound estrangement from belief. Marietta noticed it first not in his words but in his habits. He no longer crossed himself before meals. He no longer rose for Mass. When their youngest child asked about God, he answered with a parable so dry and ambiguous that even the child seemed unconvinced. To him, religion had become a tool, a useful illusion for rulers, a mechanism for order. Its moral weight, once perhaps sincere in his youth, had eroded under the acid of disillusion. And so Marietta prayed alone. At church, she sat in the back, veiled, quiet. She heard the sermons increasingly allude to corruption, to deception, to those who would teach rulers to sin in the name of order. The priest never said his name, but she knew. Everyone did. I Principe had not been printed yet, but it had already become myth. Some days strangers came to their door. Students, writers, nobles, foreign visitors, all seeking the mind that had dared to unmask politics. Niccolò greeted them with charm, wine, and wit. He relished the attention, even as he pretended indifference. He played the role of the misunderstood thinker, the philosopher cast from the city he tried to save. He knew how to make his suffering seem noble. But Marietta knew better. She saw the restlessness, the need, the way his hands trembled when he read a rejection, the way he scowled when the children interrupted him, not out of anger, but frustration, that he could no longer shape the future, only explain its failures. She tried once, gently, to ask if he regretted writing The Prince. Not the idea, he would never disavow those, but the consequences, the cost. He looked at her for a long moment, then said only, "If I had not written it, I would be forgotten already." It was the kind of answer that offered nothing and everything. The city that had exiled him now whispered about him in corners. He was Machiavellian before the term existed, a man too honest to be trusted, too observant to be ignored. Princes read his manuscript in secret, some disgusted, others emboldened. Cardinals warned of his influence. He had become a mirror no one wanted to look into, because it did not flatter, it revealed. And still he remained in exile. His children grew. The boys argued about politics. The girls married into safer families. Marietta remained the axis around which all spun. Quiet, pragmatic, faithful. Not a heroine in public eyes, but a steward of order, of sanity, of memory. Niccolò would often mock the idea of virtue in his writings. But Marietta was its quiet embodiment. She did not speak in theories. She lived them. Dignity without recognition, endurance without complaint. She did not fear his darkness because she understood where it came from, but even she could not prevent what came next. In 1517, rumors reached Rome that the prince had influenced French courtiers. The church took notice. Pope Leo X, a Medici, ordered that the book be examined. It would not be formally condemned until 1559, but the suspicion began earlier. The idea that this modest, exiled Florentine was teaching rulers how to sin with efficiency was intolerable. Local priests began to visit, not for prayer, but for surveillance. One asked whether Niccolò kept contact with foreign ambassadors. Another warned Marietta that her husband's ideas might invite scrutiny, not just of him, but of the household. She smiled, offered them wine, and locked the study tighter. Niccolò, for his part, was flattered. He joked that if the church feared him, then he had done something worthwhile. But Marietta did not laugh. She had seen what fear looked like when it came to collect. She had lived through the years when her husband's name was a liability, not a legend, and she feared it was happening again. He began to write more furiously, not just treatises, but plays, letters, essays. He tried to reshape his image, to show the world that he was more than the devil's secretary, that he was a patriot, a historian, a student of virtue even when he wrote of vice. But the world does not always forgive those who hold up a mirror, and it certainly does not reward those who reflect its ugliness with clarity. So he remained at the edge, admired but excluded, quoted but untrusted. Marietta, watching from behind the curtain of history, understood the tragedy more deeply than he ever could. He had given the world a truth it could not bear, and had been punished for saying aloud what others only practiced in silence. She did not say this to him. Instead, she lit candles. She managed the accounts. She ensured their children were educated, their names unsullied. She kept his papers dry and his legacy intact, because history may belong to those who write it, but it is preserved by those who endure it. And behind every devil's secretary, there is a woman cleaning the ink from his cuffs, praying for the soul of a man the world would call monstrous, but who, to her, had simply been a man in love with order, wounded by chaos and never once certain where the line between the two truly lay. By the time Niccolò Machiavelli turned 50, his name had grown heavier than the man himself. It moved ahead of him like a shadow cast at sunset, long, stretched, sometimes unrecognizable. He had become a man known more by reputation than by presence, and that reputation had crystallized into something neither fully admired nor entirely reviled, but whispered like a warning. Beware of men who see the world too clearly. In Florence, the Medici regime tightened its grip. Power was no longer worn with velvet gloves, but wielded with velvet ropes, soft on the outside, strangling within. And Machiavelli, still living in his modest villa in the countryside, remained unwelcome in the palace halls he once roamed freely. The very government that had once relied on his reports and trusted his judgment now viewed him as a contaminant, not for what he had done, but for what he might still inspire. But things changed slowly and unevenly. By 1520, after years of humiliation, the tides shifted. The Florentine authorities, perhaps tired of fearing him, or perhaps recognizing that excluding a mind so sharp was like locking away a sword in a burning house, offered him a commission. Not political office, not command, a task, a history. They asked him to write the history of Florence. Marietta received the news first in the form of a letter smuggled through a family friend. She read it in the dim light of the kitchen, lips pressed, eyes unmoving. Then she placed it before her husband at the breakfast table, without a word. Niccolò read the letter 3 times before lifting his head. She expected triumph. Instead, she saw something softer. Gratitude, not for Florence, but for her. Because in that moment, both of them knew she had been the reason he had survived the long, bitter interregnum between relevance and revival. He took the commission with quiet ceremony, cleaned his ink-stained coat, and returned to Florence. Not as a statesman, but as a scholar. It was a compromise, but a symbolic one. He walked streets where his name had once been feared, and now was simply known. Familiar like an old scar. Marietta stayed behind in St. Andrea, managing the household, ensuring the vineyard did not decay. The books were balanced, the children stayed fed and educated. She received his letters like dispatches from the front, filled with observations, laments, and occasionally brief flashes of hope. In the city, Niccolò kept to himself. He visited libraries, met with historians, and walked alone in the cloisters of old government buildings. He avoided the Medici court when he could, and bowed politely when he could not. He wrote with diligence, though not affection, crafting a history of Florence not as an elegy, but as an autopsy. Back home, Marietta read the pages he sent with increasing unease. The tone was distant, almost surgical. This was not the voice of the husband who once dreamed of civic virtue, nor even the disillusioned philosopher who wrote The Prince. It was the voice of a man mapping rot with precision, not to cure it, but to remember it before it buried itself beneath lies. Their eldest son, Bernardo, had grown into a thoughtful young man with an appetite for politics. He asked questions, probed his father's work, even dared to criticize his conclusions. Niccolò, to his credit, welcomed the challenge, but Marietta saw the danger. The Machiavelli name was still a loaded weapon, and Florence was still a city that forgot favors faster than it forgave ideas. She warned Bernardo quietly, firmly, "Caution is not cowardice when you carry a cursed name." The warning landed, but uneasily. The boy wanted to believe that his father's brilliance could still be a path, not a burden. But even Niccolò knew better. He had come to see his name not as a torch, but as a firebrand, useful in rare hands, dangerous in most. He had once hoped to teach princes. Now he hoped only to be read. Marietta understood before he did that this was legacy's cruel trick. It often comes at the price of peace. Niccolò was writing not to save Florence, or even to save himself, but to ensure that the record would not be written only by the victors. He knew too well how power revised the past. His history was an act of rebellion, dressed as scholarship, laced with irony. And yet, amid all this, there were moments, rare, fragile, when the man re-emerged from the myth. One afternoon, while revisiting Florence, Niccolò returned home unannounced. Marietta found him sitting in the garden, drinking cheap wine, smiling to himself. The children were grown. The vineyard hummed in late summer heat. The wind carried distant church bells. He spoke of nothing political, only of a bird he had watched on the road, of how the sky seemed wider than he remembered, of how time was not a straight line, but a circle. Everything returning, always in different shapes. She listened without interrupting. It was the first time in years he had spoken like a man untethered from consequence. But the moment passed quickly. Florence would not let him rest for long. His name, still half banned in polite society, was invoked whenever a ruler acted with calculation. Some praised it, others cursed it, but all understood. Machiavelli no longer referred to a man. It referred to a condition, one of brutal clarity. The Medici, never forgetting, never forgiving, kept him at arm's length. They used his talent, but never his counsel. They admired his pen, but never his presence. And so, despite the commission, despite the partial return to Florence, Niccolò remained a man caught between worlds, not trusted by the powerful, not embraced by the righteous, and barely understood by the people he had tried to serve. Marietta watched this slow disintegration with the patience of a woman who had seen too much to be surprised. She saw his exhaustion. She saw the manuscripts growing thicker, the letters growing shorter, the nights growing longer. She saw the way he looked at their children, with pride but also warning, because he knew what it meant to carry the weight of a name that had outgrown the body it once belonged to. And she, Marietta Corsini, bore that weight alongside him, quietly, constantly. In church, people still glanced at her, some out of curiosity, some out of pity, a few out of fear. But she no longer noticed. Her husband's name had been forged in fire. Her role was to carry its ashes, not with shame, but with the knowledge that history is not made by those who shout, but by those who endure the echo. And in that echo, she could still hear his voice, fierce, flawed, brilliant, asking only to be remembered not as a monster, but as a man who dared to tell the truth about monsters, even if that truth cost him everything. In the final years of his life, Niccolò Machiavelli's hands wrote faster than his body could keep up with. The tremors in his joints were not visible to many, but Marietta saw them each morning as he fumbled with his inkpot, and each night as he massaged his own fingers, pretending not to wince. Age had not broken him, but it had made the work heavier. Not the writing itself, but the silence that followed it. The stillness of a man who once dreamed of sculpting the fate of cities and now sculpted sentences in exile. Yet he refused to stop. He could not. The commissions were small, a short history here, a commentary there. The great doors of power remained closed to him, but letters still came. From Rome, from Venice, from curious scholars and cautious diplomats. Most praised his clarity, some asked for manuscripts, a few requested advice. But none offered a return to relevance. Niccolò answered them all, faithfully, thoughtfully, and with the tone of a man who knew he was being read by people far more comfortable than he. Marietta became the uncredited steward of this late correspondence. She organized papers, sorted drafts, and manage replies when his hands were stiff. Though untrained in politics, she could see the pattern. Niccolò's readers wanted proximity to genius, but not responsibility for it. They sought the sharpness of his mind without the burden of his name. In private, he mocked them, but in truth, he needed them. These exchanges gave structure to his decline. They were evidence that he still mattered, even if only as a voice from the margins. His most faithful correspondent was Francesco Vettori, a man of courtly standing who could move between regimes with the slipperiness Niccolò often admired and sometimes envied. Their letters were filled with humor, bitterness, confession. They joked of aging, of wine, of women, but beneath the surface ran the river of their shared exile, one by banishment, the other by compromise. In one letter, Niccolò described his daily life with painful clarity. By day, he bartered with peasants and played dice at the tavern. By night, he put on his finest robe and entered the courts of ancient men, meaning the classics, Livy, Tacitus, Plato. I speak with them, he wrote, and they answer me. It was both beautiful and tragic. A man denied entry into the courts of the living, now supping nightly with the dead. Marietta read these letters too, when he allowed it, and in them she saw a portrait more intimate than any painting. A man who cloaked despair in cleverness, who disguised longing as wit. He made jokes so others wouldn't hear the echo of doors that no longer opened. There were moments, rare and brittle, when he spoke to her of what he feared. He feared that his ideas would be twisted, that the prince would become a handbook for tyrants rather than a mirror to shame them. He feared that his name would outlive him in ways he could no longer control. Most of all, he feared being forgotten by the very republic he had tried to warn. Marietta never lied to comfort him. She did not tell him the world would understand. She only told him that his children would, that perhaps in a quieter century, his truths might be heard differently. That time has a way of choosing which voices to resurrect. But even that hope seemed fragile. In 1525, 2 years before his death, Niccolò was offered one last chance, a brief commission to mediate a minor dispute in Florence. It was small, inconsequential, but it ignited something old in him. He polished his boots, straightened his coat, and returned to the city with the eagerness of a man trying not to appear eager. The meeting was brief. The task was performed well. The payment was modest. But afterward, there was nothing more. When he returned to Sant'Andrea, he was quiet for days, not sulking, not bitter, just quiet, like a man who had finally stopped hoping. Marietta understood without asking. She prepared his meals with greater care, kept the children away from his study, and placed fresh paper beside his writing desk each morning, even when it went untouched. She knew he was now writing not to be read, but to remain sane. Writing had always been his rebellion against insignificance. Now it was his defense against oblivion, and still the world outside turned. The church, sensing the winds of dissent in the Reformation, began to tighten its grip. Humanist thinkers across Europe were being silenced, censored, or condemned. Though the Prince had not yet been printed, its reputation spread. Some saw Machiavelli as the prophet of secular modernity. Others saw him as a seducer of kings, a corrupter of virtue. He had written a book about power, but in doing so, he had become a prisoner of its image. Marietta received a warning from a relative that Niccolò's name was on a list in Rome. Not yet formal, not yet dangerous, but noticed. She showed it to him without dramatics. He read it, shrugged, and said, "At least I know I was heard." But she saw the flinch behind the joke. Their children had grown into the world he feared, one where survival required silence, where ideas were weighed not by truth, but by threat. Bernardo, their eldest, had begun to speak publicly in defense of moderation, of law, of civic order. Niccolò cautioned him gently. Marietta cautioned him fiercely. The boy bore both with patience, but the shadow of the name hung heavy on him. One evening, as Niccolò sat beneath a fig tree, his knees wrapped in wool, he asked Marietta whether she thought he had done good. She did not answer right away. Then she said, "You told the truth. That is not always good, but it is rare." He nodded, then said nothing more. The next morning, he wrote the preface to what would be his final essay. It was not about power or politics. It was about memory, about how people remember only what suits them and forget the rest, about how truth, unarmed, walks slowly. Marietta saved that page. She did not know if the world would ever read it, but she knew what it cost him to write it. Because in the end, the tragedy of Machiavelli was not that he taught rulers to be cruel, but that he believed they already were, and only hoped to make them honest about it. And the tragedy of Marietta was that she loved a man who spent his life trying to warn the world, only to find the world preferred its illusions. But she did not pity him. She folded his letters. She dried his manuscripts. She preserved his name with care, because some truths, like some names, must be carried through fire if they are to survive at all. In the spring of 1527, the skies over Italy darkened, not with storms, but with flags. The Holy Roman Empire had turned its gaze upon Rome, and its soldiers, unpaid and feral, descended like wolves upon the eternal city. The sack of Rome, brutal and apocalyptic, shattered not just the capital of Christendom, but the illusion of its untouchable authority. It was not the wrath of kings, but the hunger of mercenaries that tore through basilicas and burned holy relics. And as news of the catastrophe swept north, Florence stirred. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the city that had turned its back on the Republic once again raised the banner of popular rule. The Medici were expelled. The people took to the streets. Old Republican names were spoken with reverence. And in the shadow of his vineyard, Niccolò Machiavelli allowed himself a moment of belief that the world at last was circling back to him. He had waited years for this, a Florence without the Medici, a city in need of guidance, of restoration, of vision. His vision. He sent letters, met with former allies, and drafted proposals to help stabilize the new government. He offered his services humbly, urgently. He pleaded indirectly through contacts and old friends. And Florence, now again a republic, said no. It was not a cruel refusal. It was worse, a silent one. He had served the Medici too recently, even if reluctantly. He had written too candidly, too coldly. His name had become radioactive, a symbol not of freedom, but of cunning, not of virtue, but of manipulation. The republic he had championed no longer trusted the man who had dared to describe its enemies too well. Marietta found him standing in the doorway that evening, coat still dusty from the city, face as still as carved stone. "They don't want me," he said, not with anger, but with a bewilderment so deep it sounded like disbelief. Marietta did not ask what had happened. She only took his hand, and for the first time in years, he let her lead him away from the window. In the days that followed, his health began to falter. It started with a cough, persistent but light. Then came the fever, the weight loss, the nights where he shivered beneath heavy blankets, sweat soaking the linen. Physicians were called. Remedies were tried. None worked. His body, like his ambition, began to fail him. Slowly, then all at once. He asked for paper, even as his fingers trembled too violently to hold the pen. Marietta sat beside him, quill in hand, transcribing his last thoughts as he dictated. Not treatises or strategies now, but fragments, observations, laments, aphorisms. He spoke of Roman heroes, of Florentine betrayals, of laughter, of fire, of fortuna. One night, in a rare moment of clarity, he whispered to her, "They will only understand when it is too late." She nodded, though she knew they might never understand at all. On June 20, 1527, Niccolò Machiavelli died at the age of 58. There were no state funerals, no crowds, no proclamations. He was buried modestly at Santa Croce, in a church that would one day be called the Temple of Italian Glories, though at that moment it was only a quiet tomb among hundreds. Florence did not mourn loudly. It had other concerns. Foreign troops at the border, fragile alliances, internal factions clawing for advantage. The man who had once offered a blueprint for strength was now dust beneath its stones. Marietta stood by his grave in silence, dressed in black, her face unreadable. A few close friends came. Most stayed away. To associate too closely with Machiavelli was still dangerous. His ideas had outlived his body, and in doing so, had become ghosts, useful, feared, and whispered in corners. In the weeks that followed, she returned to their home in San Andrea. The vineyard continued. The chickens still pecked at the earth. The children, now grown, mourned in private ways, some with tears, some with distance. Bernardo took up the task of organizing his father's writings, unsure if they would ever be printed. The world was not ready, but the world would change. Marietta walked through the rooms where he had written, her fingers tracing the grooves worn into his desk, her eyes landing on unfinished drafts, half-filled letters, scrawled thoughts in the margins of ancient texts. She gathered them with care, not as relics, but as memory. She did not see genius. She saw persistence, pain, precision. She cleaned his study each day, even when no one entered it. Outside of Florence, the reputation of Machiavelli began to grow in secret. The Prince was first printed posthumously in 1532, 5 years after his death. It spread like wildfire, across courts, across borders, across generations. Kings read it behind closed doors. Popes condemned it. Philosophers debated it. And somewhere between fear and fascination, Machiavellian entered the lexicon. No longer a man, but a warning. They said he taught rulers to be monsters. They said he stripped politics of its soul. They said he glorified lies. But none of them had ever watched him labor over a paragraph for hours, trying to explain why men betray the things they love. None of them had sat across from him in candlelight, seeing the doubt that flickered beneath his certainty. None of them had carried his sickness, his shame, his silence. Only she had. Marietta Corsini lived on for many years after his death. Her name did not appear in books. Her portrait was never painted, but in every manuscript saved, every page preserved, every word protected, her hand remained. She had not challenged him. She had not tried to fix him. She had simply stayed. And in doing so, she became the last wall between his brilliance and the world's judgment. Not to defend him, but to remind the world that even those who write about cruelty may still die as husbands, with regrets they cannot rewrite. The myth of Machiavelli would rise in thunder, but its foundation had been kept dry by quiet hands. The world would remember the Secretary of Florence. It would never know the woman who made sure the ink never ran dry. Long after Niccolò Machiavelli was gone, long after the prince had ignited the fury of popes and the admiration of kings, the house in San Andrea in Percusina remained. The vineyards still grew along the hillside. The shutters still creaked in the wind. But inside, the rooms were quieter, the air heavier. He was no longer at the desk, no longer pacing, no longer arguing with ancient philosophers as if they were house guests. But she was still there. Marietta Corsini, widow of a man who redefined how the world spoke of power, had never considered herself part of his legacy. She had never asked to be remembered. She had never published a word. She had only watched, year after year, season after season, as a brilliant, impossible man tried to wrestle meaning from a world that rewarded betrayal more often than truth. And now, with Niccolò buried and his ideas spreading like wildfire across Europe, she found herself haunted not by grief, but by paradox. The man she had married in a modest Florentine ceremony had died forgotten by his city, and yet his words now echoed in halls of power far beyond it. Emperors dissected his chapters. Cardinals burned his name into sermons. Generals whispered his maxims before battle. He had become a force, not a memory. And the world would never know the man, only the mask he left behind. Marietta kept the letters. She kept the drafts. She kept the subtle corrections written in his hand on the margins of manuscripts that scholars now copied with trembling reverence. She kept the notes he never sent, the reflections he never published, the softer things, the questions he asked only in the dark. Because Niccolò Machiavelli, history's great cynic, the man blamed for legitimizing cruelty and deception, had once wondered whether truth and kindness could ever live in the same house. He had not answered that question, but he had lived it, with her. She remembered nights when he had come home from Florence, disillusioned, defeated, full of venom toward men who wore virtue like armor, but acted like butchers. He would pace the floor, spit invectives, call them cowards, fools, liars, and then, Before bed, he would hold her hand and tell her he feared he might become like them if he let the bitterness go too deep. He had become something else entirely. Not a tyrant, not a coward, but something lonelier. A mirror too honest for the world to look into without blinking. And Marietta? She had been the one holding the mirror steady. After his death, she received letters. Not condolences, but inquiries. Young thinkers wanted copies of his essays. Foreign publishers requested authorization to reprint his work. Critics asked her to explain what he really meant. She answered few of them. She did not believe the world was ready to understand, because Niccolò had not written for now. He had written for the moment after virtue failed, for the rulers standing on ruins, asking what had gone wrong. But she, more than anyone, knew he had always hoped virtue would succeed. He had written of fear, because he had seen love fail too often. He had written of cruelty, because he had watched weakness invite slaughter. He had written of deception, because he had lived among men who could not tell the truth, even to themselves. And yet in their kitchen, in their garden, in the soft hours between his battles with the world, he had still been capable of gentleness. Not always, not perfectly, but honestly. And that was the Niccolò the world would never meet. He would go on to be hated, admired, feared, misunderstood. His name would become a weapon, his ideas twisted to justify evil, ambition, conquest. But in her memories, he remained something far less dramatic, a man with ink-stained cuffs whose laughter could still surprise her, who loved his children and feared irrelevance more than damnation. Years passed. Marietta aged slowly, then all at once. Her children had children of their own. The house grew quieter. The study remained untouched. Visitors came and went. Scholars, pilgrims, the curious. Some were reverent, some arrogant. All of them sought him. None asked about her. And yet it was her hands that had kept his pages safe. Her judgment that preserved his intentions. Her silence that protected his contradictions from being flattened by time. No statues bore her name. No books quoted her words. But in the long corridor of history, she was a figure in the background, not erased, but unlit. And perhaps that was fitting. Niccolò had always believed that power belonged to those who knew how to wield the unseen. So had she. On the final day of her life, she sat beneath the olive tree where he once dictated his last fragments. A breeze moved through the branches. The vineyard shimmered with light. And she felt something strange, not peace, but balance. He had lived at war with illusions. She had lived in the shadow of a man the world mistook for something he never fully was. Together they had created nothing short of a revolution, not with swords or armies, but with questions sharpened into prose. As the sun set, the world continued to argue about Machiavelli, whether he was a monster or a prophet, a patriot or a cynic, a genius or a devil. They debated the meaning of virtù, of fortuna, of whether a prince should be feared or loved, but none of them asked who washed his shirts, who burned the letters that would have ruined him, who whispered prayers for a soul he claimed not to believe in. No one asked who taught him in silence that loyalty was not weakness, and no one saw the shadow behind the secretary. But it was there. It had always been there, because history, like power, needs someone to hold the candle while the world looks at the flame.